Hi everybody and welcome to the Renaissance Builder. Today I want to talk to you guys about soldering and soldering iron care. So without further ado, let's get started. So what has brought this on is the fact that here on the Renaissance Builder channel we are getting into electronics, and which is going to require soldering, right? And I've done quite a bit of soldering in my day, not like a high-level professional, but enough to be dangerous, I guess. So I thought it would be prudent to actually lift up my own skills and take you guys along for the journey. And this starts with proper care of your soldering iron. Okay, so let's start with the basics. Soldering irons are hot. Don't burn yourself with it. That's basic, right? That's right from the very beginning. So the one thing you don't want to do, and something I'm really bad at doing, is you don't want to overheat your tip. If you overheat your tip, you end up burning off your tin or TIM. I'm not sure which one it is. It's the coating of solder that's on the tip. You end up burning that off, or getting, corrosion on it, and then it doesn't solder correctly. So the crappiest thing you can do to your soldering iron, and it'll screw it up the fastest, is overheating your tip. So like these soldering irons that you just plug in and leave on, that happens pretty much all the time. You plug it in, you leave it on, and after a while it's like, oh shoot, this thing's burned. It's annoying. Try to avoid it. Like, the best situation is a soldering iron that's only on when you need it. But that's a little hard to do without spending a lot of money. So these ones, the butane ones, at least the snap-on one, is adjustable. So really, when you have an adjustable soldering iron, don't have it any hotter than it needs to be. And by that I mean, if you can use a low setting and all you're doing is really small wire, then you can put it on the low setting and, melt the solder in, and you can get the job done without having to be too hot. So, if you need something bigger, well, then you can turn the heat up a bit on it and get into something bigger. Point is, don't have it too hot or you'll burn your tip. And that just ruins your day when it comes to soldering. It's not something that can't be fixed, and we'll go over that, but it's annoying for sure. The next, and I kind of think this is an obvious one, is proper soldering stand placement. I have a silicon mat. This blue mat, it's silicon, it's heat resistant. I've soldered on it quite a bit, and there's marks and stuff, but for the most part it's heat resistant, so I can just put the tip right on it if I, was so inclined. I'm not, but I could. However, 90% of the stuff on your bench is not heat resistant. So if I am being clumsy and I just set my soldering iron down and it lands on a piece of wire, well, not only is it going to burn the wire, but it's also going to leave some crud on your tip, which again messes up the tip. So be careful where you're placing your soldering iron. They almost always come with some kind of stand. In this case, the stand is built into it. So I have no excuse for poor placement of my soldering iron. A lot of times the good quality soldering stations actually have a little slot for you to hold it in. The really cheap ones usually have some kind of crappy metal stand or whatever. Either way, something that holds your soldering iron off the table and gives you a place to put it where it's not going to melt or burn anything. So that's important. So don't overheat it. Don't burn yourself with it. Don't overheat it. And placement. Be careful where you're putting it. So those are kind of like the basics, right, of using a soldering iron. Okay, so those are the basics. Now let's get into a little more advanced soldering iron technique. Now, I just got a couple things in the mail, and this is where I have to up my game. When you're using a soldering iron, there's a couple features on here that you need to know. And the tip of the soldering iron, so we talked about this earlier, these soldering iron tips are actually coated with an anti-corrosion surface coating. That surface isn't necessarily conducive to soldering itself. You have to make it conducive. And what that involves is fluxing the tip and then they call it tinning the tip. It's basically putting solder on the tip and letting it stick there like it's a coating of solder. In fact, I can show you a tip that I haven't used, and they come pre-tinned. So you can get these tips pre-tinned, and if you'll notice, if it'll focus in here, they're shinier on the very end. So it's literally, the end of it is shinier than the rest of it because it's pre-tinned. Like, solder will stick right to that. If in the event that you burn your tip, like you're probably going to do, you can re-tin the tip. And what that usually involves is some kind of flux, and then just literally resoldering the tip of your soldering iron, applying new solder to it, or new tin. Tin is called a thermal interface material. TIM, thermal interface material. So it's TIM. So every time I say TIM, just think of it. It's the solder. It's the thermal interface material. Whatever. So let's go over. And the soldering iron you get may not be timmed. I mean, I would be surprised, because that's just kind of common these days to pre-tim them, but it may not be. So let's go over how you tin a tip. I have this one right here that's a little on the cruddy side, so we're going to use this one to do the job. The first thing you want to do when it comes to, we just want to get this thing to heat up a bit. The first thing you want to do when it comes to tinning your tip is you want to clean it. And there are several ways to do that properly. I'm going to tell you what not to do here real quick. Do not take sandpaper to your tip, to anywhere close to your soldering iron for that matter. Do not do it. As I mentioned, there's a coating on these tips that keeps them from corroding away under the resin, which is essentially an acid, because what the flux does is the flux cleans the metal so that the solder will stick. If you don't have a good quality metal like copper for it to clean, it will eat away at the metal. And what's under the metal that's underneath these tips, underneath that coating, is crap. Because it needs to heat up quickly, so it's kind of soft, and the acid of the flux will eat away at it. So do not take sandpaper or wire brush or anything abrasive to your tip. Now, I have one here that is incredibly dirty. I'm pretty sure I used it to melt holes on a piece of plastic, and it was like in a sticky situation. It was a bad situation, and it messed up this tip. Like, this tip is messed up. But it can be repaired. I'm not sure yet, I may have to take some emery cloth, and this is literally like the back side of a sponge. I may have to take some emery cloth to clean it decently, but I'm going to try to do it without. So, but again, never, ever, ever, ever go to the sandpaper or anything more abrasive like that. Alright, so it doesn't look like that solder is melting too well. You know what, let me use this solder over here. So there's a couple ways to do it correctly. Alright, yeah, we're good. The way that you'll most often see is a wet sponge. And the way that works is kind of a steam action, right? So the sponge, and I have this tip here, it's heated up, it's meltable, is you literally are going to try cleaning this tip with the wet sponge. Check that out. You can see it already. It's starting to get shiny. I think what I'm going to end up doing for the sake of the video is I'm going to purposely, well, no, I have this one, so we'll see how this one does. Alright, and so you can see there's a couple spots on here where it is not nicely coated. So that's the first thing for cleaning a tip, is a wet sponge. It's the easiest. You can use any kind of sponge as long as it holds water. The water keeps it from burning, and the sponge allows it basically pulls off the extra solder. So here's the other thing that you can use to clean, and this is the more professional route. It's called a copper sponge. It literally looks like some kind of copper Brillo pad or whatever, but the whole idea is the copper is able to scrape down the tip. Like, literally, you just jam it in there and wiggle it around. The copper is able to essentially scrape down the tip without damaging it. Like, it's not so abrasive that it takes the coating off. And I pretty much got this thing cleaned up with the wet sponge, so it's really not going to do much more than that. So that's your two ways to clean off, essentially. And when you have a good a soldering iron that's set up really well, pretty much all you're going to need is either a wet sponge or the abrasive. But another thing I picked up, and this is something I've never used before, another thing I picked up is called tip cleaner. By the way, both of these things I got on Amazon, and it was like 10 bucks for the lot of it. It's not that expensive, so I figured, you know, why not upgrade? So the tip cleaner is kind of like Flux, from what I understand. It's kind of like a Flux, and it's something that you stick your tip down in, and it's supposed to clean off your tip and allow it to, I don't know, we'll see what it does. But essentially the idea is that when you get done soldering, you can put this down in here, and it's supposed to clean off your tip. Oh, wow. Oh, I see. Yep. Oh, wow. Yeah, that does it. Yep. That does it all right. So, tip cleaner. I just found out what it does. And I'm definitely going to recommend it. Let's turn this off and let it cool down. All right. Let's talk about this. Because I just learned what it was. Oh, man. We're all learning together here. Like I said, I'm trying to up my game here. Tip cleaner. So what this is it's flux and solder all in the same stuff. So it's apparently a pretty aggressive flux. So when you dip your tip in it, it literally tins it for you. I'm impressed. Like, it does a pretty good job. Like, that tip is perfectly tinned. It's beautiful. Highly recommend this stuff. All right, so there we go. Now I have a beautifully tinned tip. So, again, we're going to reiterate over the process of what we just did here. Dirty tip wasn't too bad. A little on the burnt side, a little bit. And the first thing we did, wet sponge, right? So this is easy enough. In fact, even if you just get like a paper towel and you make it wet, that even works. So if you have a soldering iron and you haven't done any soldering iron maintenance before, start with a wet paper towel or sponge, whatever you can find to do that. And just start wiping it off. Heat it up to melting point and just start wiping it off on the wet sponge. From there, right, if you want to up your game and you're going to do this consistently like you're supposed to, you have the option of the copper Brillo pad thingy, the copper cleaner. Now the point of this is that you can dip your tip in there every time. So every time you go to solder, you are doing your solder, and then you go, and then you put it down, right? And we went over that, put it down carefully. That way when you put your soldering iron down, the tip is cleaned off nicely. You don't have any excess gunk on there to build up and corrode your tip and burn it. That's the idea. And then the tip tinner, whew, this stuff works really good. So every now and again, you can have this sitting there, and then every now and again, you just literally re-tin the tip. That's impressive. I'm very tickled with that. So that being said, I got 2 more steps to go. Hopefully this video doesn't get too long. Oh man, we're already at 18 minutes. I'm gonna have to edit. So 2 more steps. So stick with me. We've got 2 more things to do to talk about soldering. Here's a tip: when you're using butane, there's an exhaust port, and that exhaust port is hot. So always make sure that exhaust port is going to point away from your work. Okay, so at this point I want to talk just a little bit about soldering practices, because it has to do with maintenance of your soldering iron. So what I want to do here, my soldering project here, is I want to solder the end of these and make them a much more resilient surface to actually attach things to, whether I want it to be a wire nut or whatever, so that I don't keep having a crummy thing. So, soldering a wire, pretty straightforward, right? Helping hands, that's what these are called. Anything that you're using, again, I have so much stuff from Radio Shack that's like old stuff from radio, well, not that old, but I have so much stuff from Radio Shack, man, that place was great. So, helping hands is basically anything that can hold on to the object you're working on so that your hands are free to do what it is you need to do. They're great. I highly recommend getting some form of them for if you're doing soldering, if you're working on small things, mostly soldering actually, in my case. But either way, they're well worth the investment. They're not expensive, but they're well worth the investment. So all I do is I'm going to clip this in, right, just so that it's there. Now, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to flux the wire. Now you can, since the solder has flux in it, it's rosin core solder, rosin flux, kind of the same thing. Since there's flux inside the wire, you can avoid it, but it never hurts to have enough. That's a little much. So you flux it, right? First you get it in the position that you want it, flux it, now we're going to solder it. My helping hands are not strong enough. Let's get this stupid thing up in a manageable position, huh? So, now that I have my tip maintenance kit here, I'm going to show you what we do. All right, so I pull my soldering iron up, and first of all, it's not hot, so, light the sucker up. And then take it to the lowest setting for the solder. In other words, this solder is, what is this? This is 0.62 diameter, 0.62 inch. It's small, but kind of a medium grade. This stuff is tiny. I don't need as much heat for this as I do for this. And it turns out your solder is what really dictates how much heat you need in an appliance to do the job. For a larger job, like a larger wire, you're going to want a thicker solder, which means you're going to need more heat. So that's really what that comes down to. But if I'm doing something like soldering, and this is something we'll get to, here's a little teaser. The circuit that I made here on this breadboard, I'm going to end up soldering to a breakout board. And I don't need big solder, so I can use the small stuff, so I need less heat to do that job. All right. So we pick it up, make sure it's hot enough, put some solder on there. So here's the ticket. You throw some solder on it, flick it off, gets the tip nice and clean. But here's the ticket. You want a little bit of solder on the tip of your soldering iron because it helps heat up the object that you're working on. And it all has to do with surface contact, right? So I'm going to put a little bit of solder on there. And then I'm going to come in and let that solder sit on there. Now, I'm going to just literally start at the tip of the wire and drag it back towards the insulation. This is going to create a nice, there we go, bond of solder. And it doesn't overheat the insulation. By starting at the tip of the wire and then working towards the insulation, you don't overheat the insulation as much. Now I'm going to clean off the excess solder in my little brush here, right? And I'm going to set it to the side. So that cleaned off the crap. Now I can use the stand, set it to the side, come in here, flux this wire. So we're putting some flux on that wire. And I'm going to do the same thing now. Now I just put this down so it's all right, but you may have sat this down for a while and it got a little iffy. So again, just take some solder, freshen up that tip. Then we put a little bit on, and we go to town. Now, when you're heating up the object, you want to heat both the object and the solder at the same time. Now, since we have a little bit of solder on the tip, that's going to help transfer the heat into the object quickly. And then we're going to come along and do the same thing. Drag the solder into the wire, into the insulation from the end, and there you go. Now in this case, the insulation did get a little bit hotter. So I'm going to put the solder down, right? Just like that. I'm going to take my solder tip and I'm going to jam it up in there. Cleans the tip off nicely. So at this point, we have soldered the ends of our wires so that they're nice and solid. I can clamp them on things. Either way, the solder project is done. And the very key point that I wanted to point out is proper solder etiquette. When you are done with that joint or the series of joints you're going to make, so say I wanted to line up a bunch of joints to solder at the same time. Do the joints, do your soldering. As soon as you're done with that part of the project, you clean your tip off. You take your sponge and you just clean your tip off. And then put your soldering iron down. Now, in the case that you are done with your soldering iron, obviously you're going to turn it off, unplug it, or whatever you do. If you are going to be doing another joint, right shortly, then of course you would leave it on. Again, at the lowest heat necessary, you're going to leave it on and properly placed. Do whatever it is you need to do, and then pick the iron up, redo your tip, go to town. So that's the course of action, and the important thing here is that adding a proper cleaning substance, whether it be a wet sponge or a copper sponge, adding a proper clean right after you're done using the soldering iron makes your tip go a lot longer. I just finished doing this soldering project, and my tip looks like it's, well, it doesn't look like it's new, but new-ish. It looks good. Like, I can pick this up, I can put it away in the box, I can pick it up, do the same thing with the tip, and go to town. I don't have to worry about refurbishing the tip again next time, as long as I don't jam it into some more plastic to make holes. Same thing with this one. This tip is in good shape. It's going to, sit in the box for however long it needs to sit in the box. When I pick it up again, I can go right to town, dress it up with some solder, flick it off, add a little ball to do the job, and go to town. That's proper soldering iron care. Not using any more heat than you need, cleaning it off every time you're not using it, and you should be good to go to use your soldering iron. Oh, and don't take any sandpaper to it. Don't try to make your own tips. It will not work out for you. So, right tool for the right job in that case, guys. So yeah, do those things, and your soldering iron should last a good long while for you. All right, thank you very much for watching. Hopefully I edit this video down so it's nice and short for you, but thank you very much for watching. I appreciate it. Till next time, guys, take care. Make sure you hit that bell and subscribe icon and all the rest of the shenanigans, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
I think it's kind of obvious to say, be careful. These things are hot. I'm an idiot, so don't do what I do. Actually, this is YouTube, so at least hit that bell and subscribe button.